Uncontrollable madness is a blight that affects us all, from the foggy streets of 16th century London to the modern digital game storefronts of today. The threat of insanity is everywhere. This is especially true in the case of the early access version of Forgive Me, Father 2, the sequel to last year's Lovecraftian bloodbath. Its distinct comic book visuals have returned with sprite enhancements as well as increased level detail due to Unreal Engine 5, but now the madness itself is evolving, as this sequel's eldritch enemies now gradually grow into more horrific forms as you make your way deeper and deeper into this game's dark tale. You start off, rather appropriately, in an insane asylum, then fight your way through damp harbor alleys, the muddy trenches of World War II, or grimy subway stations, all while slashing and blasting with knives, axes, shotguns, rifles, and rocket launchers, all of which you're going to need to take on the even more twisted horrors that await. I loved the first game for its fluid movement, satisfying weapons, and pulpy comic book aesthetic, and all that seems to be back and better than ever in Forgive Me, Father 2. The early access version is out now on Steam, GOG, and EGS, so check out those links in the description and pinned comment below. Thanks again to Byte Barrel and Fulcrum Publishing for the sponsorship. Without further ado, let us now enter the nightmare. Welcome back to another episode of What Happened, the show that scurries through the dark hallways of gaming's horror history. While we usually cover individual titles, this week we're turning our discerning bloodshot eyeballs to an entire franchise, and to be specific, a franchise that From Software shamelessly ripped off to produce Bloodborne. Now, this is a joke. Please don't hunt me down, Max. Anyway, this is a very fractured tale of multiple publishers, money mismanagement, several tragic cancellations, all the spooky ingredients used to make our usual lip-smacking What Happened brew. So grab the nearest staff, sword, or repulsive smoke bomb as I answer the question, what happened to nightmare creatures?
My nightmare was just about to begin.
The story of these creatures of the night, at least on the business side, starts with one Nicolas Gaume, a French entrepreneur that founded Atriid Concept in 1990. Under the Atriid name, the studio produced the puzzle game Fight of the Furries, the much beloved, citation needed, pack in time for Namco, which was essentially a reskin of Fight of the Furries, and finally, future worst fighting game episode Savage Warriors in 1995. Shortly thereafter, Mindscape Entertainment bought out Atriid, where they were rebranded as Mindscape Bordeaux for about a year, only for Nicolas to rebuy the company back from Mindscape and were then rebranded once again to Kalisto Entertainment. Then in 1997, the studio produced two important titles, Dark Earth, which I've never played but have vivid memories of the box art for some reason, and our subject today, Nightmare Creatures. While Dark Earth was a post-apocalyptic adventure game with rendered 2D backgrounds, Nightmare Creatures was a fully 3D take on gothic horror, and unlike Dark Earth, made its way to consoles, namely the original PlayStation, and later the
Nintendo Ultra 64.
Since the industry was rapidly changing at this time, hitting the PlayStation with a 3D action title just as it started dominating the market became a huge boon for Kalisto, but was originally a very risky gamble for them. I spoke to Pascal Barret, the main creative force behind Nightmare Creatures, about his memories of working on the franchise, and he emphasized this point. We were at a pivotal moment in the industry where 2D games were getting old and 3D was not yet the future. We did bet on the 3D and wanted to start with a simple game to learn the ropes and create the tools. At the same time, we were all hot with the novel Anubis Ways by Tim Powers, and we started to imagine a simple action game involving sorcery in a gothic universe. By the way, the development title of the game was Gothic, and since we were fond of, now old, fantastic movies, we poured in zombies, werewolves, banshees, etc. Coppola's Dracula, which was the hottest thing in '93, had a heavy influence too. Now, reportedly, there was a very fierce bidding war for the publishing rights for Nightmare Creatures, as you'd expect for a game that melded the 3D action gameplay of Tomb Raider with the atmos and monsters of Resident Evil. Kalisto's former owners, Mindscape, had expressed interest in publishing, but it was Activision that won out in the end, backing the game with a pretty substantial marketing campaign. Even Sony Computer Entertainment stepped in to publish the game in Europe, which really helped increase Nightmare Creatures' visibility across the pond. Part of the reason the game was so in demand was that Kalisto had developed their own 3D engine for Nightmare Creatures, which Pascal explained took a lot of trial and error. We had no experience at all with 3D games. Kalisto at the time was a 2D games developer. Actually, most developers were 2D at this time. We had to learn and often create everything from scratch. We used 3D Studio, not Max, to model characters. It was then more an architecture tool than anything else. We had to build our own animation tool with nobody aware of 3D animation, and the map editor tool too. 3D was very early as well. The hardware on PS1 and Saturn was a hack on 2D chips, not real 3D. We had to deal with very low poly count. Each creature was made of less than 300 triangles. By today's standards, a simple shoe is more complex. So, with a considerable amount of hype going into its November 1997 launch, Nightmare Creatures moved a staggering 1.5 million copies, a number which includes the 1998 port on the Nintendo Ultra 64. Now, a cool 1.5 mil for a brand new IP is pretty cash money, so it's rather curious that the sequel no longer had Activision's involvement, but Konami instead. Why the sudden publisher switch? Well, Pascal relayed to me that originally Activision was set to publish, but a new producer stepped in on their side and wasn't a fan of the original game. He demanded several unnecessary technical prototypes, which wasted a ton of time and money, and even when these things were delivered, the producer remained unconvinced. This lasted long enough that the deal eventually fell apart, and a producer over at Universal Studios, who was a fan of the first game, approached Kalisto about a new publishing deal. But wait, where does Konami come in then? At this time, Universal was not that big in video game publishing and had to partner with a more international publisher, Konami. However, there was an incredible cultural gap between the two companies, and the joint venture was all fights and screams. We were stuck in between. It added a lot of pressure on the development. So Universal eventually dipped out, leaving Konami as the sole publisher, and when coupled with the wasted time under Activision, contributed to further developmental problems, something Pascal regrets. NCIII was a totally different thing. We started the project unaware of the success of the first episode. First thing we did was a list of everything we suspected went wrong in the first game and decided to change it dramatically. We should have gone for a simple sequel, with new places and new monsters. Another reason why it missed the point might be the team. NC1 was done by a dozen irresponsible pioneers. NC2 was a larger team, over 40 people, more organized, more professional. Maybe the original passion was diluted. Then it was all about catching up time, cutting off content, characters, and environments. In the end, we delivered a game that was too late, with only a small slice of what we planned it to be. But it wasn't the mixed response and slower sales to the sequel that put the brakes on Kalisto's sudden rise through the industry, but rather catastrophic business decisions which resulted in the studio and the Nightmare Creatures franchise getting cut off at the knees. 2000 was a big year. Kalisto announced that there would be a Nightmare Creatures feature film, which absolutely never wound up happening. That I could make a whole sub-series about the video game movies that were never made. And that they decided, on a whim I guess, to acquire a whole entire American development arm. Daylight Productions, whose only credited title was something called the Swamp Buggy Racing, was renamed to Kalisto Entertainment USA via a stock swap between them and the original Kalisto Entertainment. It's a little odd but not unheard of, but this would be something that would herald future events. 2000 also saw the launch of Nightmare Creatures 2, but due to the soft sales of it and Kalisto's other titles like Four Wheel Thunder and New York Race, financial strain was starting to build. Regardless, their best bet was to push forward with a third Nightmare Creatures game dubbed Angel of Darkness, which, maybe not the best subtitle there, I'm just saying, which is probably one of the most tragic canceled games I've ever heard of. While we know it was being made for 6th generation hardware, it had a female protagonist and took place in Prague, Pascal provided even more details, which makes the game sound even cooler. The project was very ambitious, much more action/adventure orientated, with lots of secondary characters, a large number of cinematics, etc. The player was to embody a young fighter accompanied by her raven, which she used to spy on or retrieve certain objects. The game was essentially set in the city of Prague with an early Assassin's Creed feel. We were in 2001. The heroine was very agile and had to make her way through crowds, explore, etc. The particularity of the game was that it worked on a day/night alteration. The day was more dedicated to exploration and the night to fighting against Crowley's creatures. As soon as the sun fell, the heroine merged with her raven to transform herself into a kind of angel of darkness. Yeah, that's right, you could have been able to anamorph yourself into a creature to fight the Nightmare Creatures. Concept art, animatics, and even some gameplay footage of Angel of Darkness has since survived, so it was pretty far along in development when everything, and I mean everything, came crashing down. Kalisto Entertainment had a strange board of directors, in that many were personal friends of Nicholas Gohm or were otherwise very famous and/or wealthy. CEOs of other multinational companies, politicians, and journalists, just to name a few. When the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, along with acquiring an American development firm, along with a movie deal that never happened, along with their titles no longer selling, well, it resulted in them pretty much being forced into compulsory liquidation. This catastrophic downturn in revenue was deemed so suspicious that regulatory authorities accused Kalisto's managers of misinforming their stockholders, with everyone wanting to know where all the money had gone.
No, I don't have your money here. It's in Bill's house.
270 individual stockholders then sued Kalisto's higher-ups, a civil case which took until 2009 to finally wrap up, and oddly, after all that, every charge against Kalisto was overturned, as it was determined there was no wrongdoing. Following that, Nicholas Gohm worked as an advisor for Codemasters from 2002 to 2005 before founding another company, Mimesis, which again saw heavy investment from prominent French business people until it hit it big with some social media game called Mamba Nation. Europeans, let me know what the hell this thing is. I can find very little info about it. The liquidation of Kalisto was happening right in the middle of Angel of Darkness's development, mind you, which was being funded this time around by Ubisoft, who apparently had no interest in bailing Kalisto out of the dilly of the pickle they now found themselves in. Pascal explained to me how this very nebulous time for the project played out, where the original version of Nightmare Creatures 3 died when Kalisto did and was restarted from scratch under its new owners. The game was to have been published by Ubisoft, but when Kalisto went into liquidation, they bought back the rights to the license, which they have held ever since. I joined Ubisoft Paris at that time precisely to continue working on the game, but different editorial choices led to the end, or rather the freezing of development. They didn't want a game that was too violent or too fantastic. I stayed about 4 years in Paris and worked on 2 different prototypes of the game, but neither went into production, unfortunately. To give me just a bit more insight into this process, I also spoke to Arthur Hugo, a concept artist who also worked at Ubisoft at that time, who was happy to detail his part on one of those early prototypes. The pre-production was focused on the main character and monster concept designs, before focusing on the first playable demo, but I don't think we had a narrative guy with us at that time. The NC3 project had several teams and several directors trying to make a convincing MVP, or minimum viable product. I was part of one of those teams, but ultimately Ubisoft asked the original creator of NC1 and 2 to work on it, who of course was Pascal. The early concept art you see here, done by Arthur, takes a more futuristic, almost biomechanical stab at the source material, and as stated, was one of several possible pitches various Ubisoft teams were experimenting with. Like Pascal said though, it seemed like Ubi higher-ups really didn't know how to make nightmare creatures fit into their mid-2000s gaming lineup, which was mostly composed of games rated E to teen, with perhaps 2005's Cold Fear taking one of their very few mature rated spots.
Great. Just great.
Regardless of the reason as to why Ubisoft didn't push forward with this sequel, it still sucks after all of that. The only other official Nightmare Creatures game we ever got was the standalone 2003 Java version, developed by Gameloft, who, at that time, were a mobile game-making factory, pumping out dozens of— oh wait, that's still true today. This really messy end to Kalisto unfortunately seems to have left a thick, unlucky fog on the franchise for like the last 15 years. And while fans' hopes were rekindled when Spooky's House of Jumpscares developer Albino Moose announced plans for a reboot/remake in 2017, further news never came. That is until this past August, where they did unfortunately confirm on their Twitter that the project has been shelved, at least for now. We'll leave on one last comment from Pascal, which is typically cryptic. I'm obviously very attached to this license. I created this universe with my former colleagues Cyril Fontaine, Frédéric Motet, among others. I took enormous pleasure in drawing and giving life to these characters and creatures, and so I'm still a little frustrated not to have been able to go to the end of a possible sequel. But never say never. We don't know what the future holds. I can only say that the story isn't over. Wait and see. Thanks again to both Arthur and Pascal for their time and patience in answering my questions. And if you know of any other fiendish fables of the video game or movie industries, do let me know in the comments below, or enter the dark cathedral of my social medias. See you next time, and thanks for watching!